Bit of a slurry there and it'll look a bit like Artex. So you just enough moisture just to move around and take out any marks on the wall. So in order to get a key onto a wall like cob, which has got a slightly friable surface, we're going to harl a first coat of lime mortar. This will stick well to the cob, to the earth here. It'll also stick well to stone or brick and provide a nice key for the next plastered coat that we're going to apply. It'll also help to control suction. If you've got a very thirsty material like cob or brick, they'll tend to draw all the moisture out of your coats of render or plaster very quickly, and you'll get not such a good lime mortar out of that, lime plaster or lime render. So we're going to control suction by harling the first coat onto the wall with a lime mortar. We're going to be using a 3.5 to 1 or a 3 to 1 lime mortar mix with a little bit of that porcelain that I mentioned earlier. We're going to be using Metastar as the porcelain that we add. That's the one that's been made in Cornwall. The mixture's quite simple. It's that lime mortar that we saw earlier, quite stiff to start with. We're going to whisk in some clean water, and once we've whisked the two together, we're going to end up with this mix, like a slurry, which we're going to use to harl against the wall. That's the kind of consistency you're looking for, thin enough to spread evenly along the whole edge of the harling trowel, and not so thick that it would just go into the wall in clumps. You can see how well that's stuck to the harling trowel. A thin covering over the whole blade. And Rick will be using that to provide that key to that cob wall. Okay, we're just going to brush off the loose material. It's especially important on a cob wall. You don't want lots of bits of cob falling off the wall when you apply your harling coat. We're damping up the wall with the churn brush here, but you can use a garden sprayer or a plant sprayer. You want to spray it up a good hour before you do the harling. Give plenty of time for the cob to absorb the water, and then it's going to reduce shrinkage. Don't just do it 1 minute before you come to harl. So we're giving this a good soak about an hour before we come to harl it.
Nice thud. Use that thud to get it to the back of the hose.
The hard coat's just a thin coat. You're not trying to build up any thickness. This is to give you a key for the next thicker coat and to control shrinkage. It's harder backhand, but when you go round a house you're going to have to do backhand and forehand. So if you're practicing first of all, practice on the forehand and then switch round to the backhand.
Don't forget the plastic on the floor.
Don't forget to cover the neighbour's BMW, the cat, the drainage, the downpipes, anything that could be a source of litigation between you and the neighbour, because this is a messy operation. That's why it's especially important to wear your safety glasses and some gloves. As you can see, it's quite a quick operation if Rick's doing it. Now we've left the hard coat to dry, and if necessary we've wetted it down if it's particularly warm time of year to control the curing process, and after 2 or 3 days it's probably ready to put the scratch coat on.
I'll do a couple of slow motion shots here. Just tip it up. That's so sticky. Right, so what we're going to do is just put a band along the top.
So we're using a lime mortar here with hair in.
What you don't want to do is start down too low. You start down there and you run out. So go right up through.
And if this was for outside, we'd have added some of the porcelain in as well, the Metastar, to give it a little bit of early strength.
It's going to need another dub coat just to get it out to a reasonable shape. Once you've got it on, we're going to just scratch it through, and then we'll be probably looking to recoat it in 3 to 4 days, depending on how quick it's going to dry and what suction's behind it. And you don't want to do the scratching immediately after you've plastered. You want to leave it for sort of 10 minutes or so, just to let it tack off a little tiny bit. And you don't want to go too deep, end up cutting it like a cheese wire.
So we've left the first scratch coat to dry, maybe 5 days a week. This is internal, although we're filming outside. This is an internal plastering we're doing onto a solid wall. For most circumstances, a 3-to-1 unhaired lime mortar is going to be fine. But occasionally, if you've got a basement with a damp wall or a high outside ground level, you might consider adding a little bit of that porcelain. Remember, the one we're talking about here is Metastar 402. Rick's just showing a little bit of the white powder. If you add a little bit of that into the lime mortar internally, you'll get a little bit of a stronger set after 2 or 3 weeks. So that's just a judgment call depending on how damp the wall's going to remain. But otherwise you're fine to go on with a 3-to-1 unhaired. We're going to do the same as we did before, put a band on at the top just to give ourselves a little thickness to work out to. Just moving the trowel sideways. We don't want to lose that band by pulling the trowel down the wall. It's just a sideways action. And this coat, the float coat we're putting on now, it's going to be about 10 mil on average. Obviously, if the wall was really shapy and had lots of holes, you might have to put a second haired coat on, a dubbing out coat, before you got to this float coat. You really want the float coat to be relatively the same thickness, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less than the 10 mil, because you're going to be floating this out as preparation for the final skim internally. And you can't make a lot up in the skim itself, so this coat's got to be floated out more or less to the shape you're looking for. It doesn't have to be flat, but if it's curvy and flowing, it's got to be a reasonably smooth surface to take the final plaster skim. So you can see there's quite a bit of planning and timing involved. You've done the harling coat, you've left that maybe a day or two to dry and cure a little bit. Then you put the haired scratch on before. That might be another 5 days to a week before that's ready to take this coat, so you've got to plan the work. Rick's just taking off the long end of the trowel and running it down onto the hook there, just to plasticize the lime a little. He'll do that again a little bit more slowly in a minute. So this 3-to-1 unhead mortar, again quite a coarse sand, because you're putting on relatively a thick coat, 8 to 10 mil. You want the sand to control any shrinkage in the mortar and make sure that when you've laid it on and floated it, it will stay as it looks. It won't shrink out further. Rick's actually laying on with a Venetian trowel there. It's a trowel that's got rounded corners and chamfered edges, designed in Italy for Italian plasters, but we find it very useful for cob or stone because it's a relatively thin blade, but not having sharp corners and having chamfered edges means that you can follow the lines of the cob or the stone a lot better. We're going to leave that for a little while, maybe an hour or two, so that it's then ready to float off with a wood float and then a devil float before we apply the top coat skimming plaster to it. Okay, so we come back to this maybe an hour or two, maybe a bit longer. It depends on how thirsty the backgrounds were. You didn't want it to dry too quickly internally. And now we're going over with a wood float. This will help to push in the mortar if there had been any shrinkage, because you maybe put it on a little bit thicker than you thought. This will help to compress any of that shrinkage and really pull the mortar together. It's also, being a wood float, going to slightly open up the texture. And by opening up the texture, it's going to make it a little bit easier for the skimming lime plaster to grip. We don't want this finishing float coat to be too smooth, otherwise the lime plaster won't grip as well. So we're going to float out with a wood float first. Most of the pressure is on the heel of the float, the front a little bit floating free of the surface. And once we've wood floated it up, we're then going to follow up with a wood float with a couple of tiny little lath nails tacked into the corner, and that's going to scratch the surface. We'll show that in a minute. Water in a render or plaster gradually drains down a wall, so it's always going to be ready to float at the top of the wall, a bit lower than the base of the wall. So if it's a high internal wall, you've always got to check the top of the wall first, because it could be ready to float up the top and the bottom might still be a little bit wet. In this penultimate coat, the float coat, we didn't put hair in when we were demonstrating here. Some people do use hair in this float coat and some don't. The problem if you have hair in is that sometimes when you come to do the devil floating, which we're going to do in a minute, the little lath nails can slightly pull the hair out of the mortar and make it difficult for the skimming plaster, the lime plaster, which is only about 3 mil in total, just to cover out those hairs. They're quite stiff, they're horse hairs. Sometimes you might choose to use the hair because you're happy that you're not going to get a problem with the floating, but also you might have still been levelling out a very uneven wall and you felt it was beneficial to have the hair even in the float coat so that you could put it on slightly thicker and not risk having too thin a coat and not quite the shape that you wanted. So it's a trade-off between those factors.
Swap over there.
So that's roughly got the shape we want, and now the devil float's just going to allow us to give a slight little bit of texture, extra texture. You don't want the nails out protruding so far that you can't move the devil float, that's too far. This key will be taken up by the first coat of the plaster skim. So now we're going to apply the internal finishing plaster skim. We make this in a variety of mixes, 2-to-1, 3-to-2 or 1-to-1. For most times, working over a wall that you've already done the 3-to-1 haired on and the float coat of 3-to-1 unhaired, it's fine to use a 2-to-1 plaster. We're going to do this in two very thin coats, about 1 to 1.5 mil each. The first coat is to take out the key and to control the suction. We've damped down the wall. This is maybe 4 or 5 days after we've put the float coat on. It's going to be ready to take the skim. We've given it a little wet up with a churn brush or a light spray with a sprayer. And this first coat is just to take out a little bit of the suction and to control the way that the top coat is going to be applied. So putting the first coat on, and then maybe an hour or two later we'll come back and it'll be ready to take the second very thin skim. So this is the second very thin coat. Obviously it's outside, so it's going to dry a lot quicker than it would do in your inside wall. We're just making sure, putting a little bit of water there, that it's ready to take the second skim. This might be an hour and a half afterwards. So the first coat that you put on took up the key in the devil floated surface and controlled the suction a little bit, and this second coat will be spread very thin, and because the first coat's on there, it'll allow you to spread it a bit finer and get a nicer finish. Some people try and do it in one coat of internal plaster, but you'll struggle a little bit to get a good finish that way. Again, we're using that Venetian trowel, the one with the rounded corners and chamfered edges. Quite a thin blade. And certainly on a wall that's got a bit of shape and curve, that'll help you to follow those curves without digging the edges of the trowel in. Obviously this has got full sun on, that's going to be a little bit trickier for us, but on your inside wall it's going to be a lot easier. We're going to leave that to just cure for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and wet it up and trowel it flatter. So we're going to show you two types of finish just for getting a final look on the internal plaster. Remember, it's an inside finish, even though we've got this on full sun on the outside. That makes it a bit trickier for Rick. We're going to show you troweling up on one side. So a little bit of water if necessary, just flicked on the wall. Otherwise, just a question of timing, when there's just enough play in the plaster to trowel it flat. You might get a little bit of fat to move around. This is where you might consider, if you are looking for a very flat finish, possibly using a 3-to-2 plaster, slightly more lime rich. 3-to-2 is equivalent to 1.5 to 1, 1.5 of sand to 1 lime putty. So it's a little bit more lime rich than a 2-to-1, and that'll give you a little bit more fat to play around with. Obviously, as we're doing this in full sun, there's not a lot of time to play around with it anyway. But this is a way of getting a little bit of give in the plaster. Still a slight bit early. We may go back to that in a few minutes just to trowel it up a little bit more, get it a little bit flatter. On the other panel, especially if you're not sure you are going to be troweling it so flat as you like, or if you're perhaps looking for a sponge finish, we're going to show you possibly wood floating up, like we did with an outside render. Again, it's a question of timing. The water will drain down the plaster from top to bottom. If it's too early, then you will work up the surface a bit too much like Artex. But if you get the timing right, you'll be able to trowel out any tool marks that you left with your final coat plaster. This wood floated approach will take out any tool marks from your troweling and give you a texture that you can then go on with a sponge to produce a sponge finish. So light pressure, just enough to move the plaster around a little bit and take out any trowel marks. And say water drains down the walls, so probably it'll be ready to go at the top a little bit earlier than it will be at the bottom. So we've gone back onto the section that we wood floated, and now we're using quite a dense hard sponge, that famous Nissan Cabstar passenger seat sponge, just to move a tiny little bit of plaster around. It'll follow the contours of a shapy wall, rounded lintels, curved reveals, bring a very fine texture to the surface. That'll be taken out by 3 coats of lime wash, is usually adequate inside, or in an hour or 2 when it's dry you can always brush the little bits of grit on the surface to get an even flatter surface if you want. Okay, now we're going to go over the bit that was troweled as a finish. Again, the sponge, it gets a question of timing. If it's too early, you'll make it slightly too textured, and maybe a minute or 2 later it'll be ready. And again, a little bit wetter there, so that part you'd leave, but you can see that either approach can give a nice flowing, very slightly textured surface just brought up by the sponge.